Today, we're delving into a brief history of food told through a history of food in 100 recipes. It's a book that explores the culture and legends behind Western food. The author is the British food writer William Sitwell. He's not only the editor of a renowned food magazine, but also a longtime contributor to the food sections of publications like the Daily Mail. As a regular judge and guest on culinary television shows, he is a prominent figure in the British food critic scene. Driven by professional work and personal interest, Sitwell has collected a vast number of antique cookbooks. While reading them, he discovered a wealth of fascinating people, stories, and cultural phenomena, which sparked the idea to chronicle historical recipes. However, this book isn't a simple compilation of recipes and imagined feasts. It's a true collection of food stories. The book is composed of 100 independent chapters. Each chapter is titled after a specific food, includes a relevant recipe excerpted from a historical document, and then weaves a narrative around the story behind it. With time as its central axis, the book spans 4 millennia, from ancient Egypt in 1900 BCE to Great Britain in 2011. It presents intriguing chefs and diners alike, along with a host of dishes, some familiar and others truly astonishing. For instance, while French cuisine is world-renowned today, a few centuries ago, its culinary offerings were rather unremarkable. The person who transformed French food was the 16th century queen, Catherine de' Medici. The moment you hear the surname de' Medici, you know she hailed from Italy's most illustrious family. She not only brought art and fashion to France, but also made immense contributions to its cuisine. In fact, encyclopedias often define her primary achievement as leading fashion and inventing puff pastry. She taught the French to use forks and crystal clear glasses and how to properly set a table. She introduced the nobility to ice cream and aspic, allowing the once unrefined French to experience the true charm of fine dining for the first time. It seems that just as the Renaissance in Europe is indebted to Italy, the rise of French gastronomy also owes its thanks to the Italians. However, the queen paid for this with her life. She eventually died from complications related to obesity. This is just one of the book's interesting anecdotes. I'll share more in a moment, but more importantly, I want to take you on a tour of the fascinating culture of food. This book contains no complex theories or dry arguments. It reads more like a collection of essays. Therefore, we will approach our integrated analysis from 2 main themes. The first theme is the historical evolution of cooking methods. Curing, burying, air drying, roasting, boiling, frying. This series of techniques appeared in chronological order, reflecting the progress of human civilization, with each method holding its own unique significance. The second theme is the history of the recipe. Why are recipes interesting? Because they not only reveal the strange and wonderful dishes of history, but also reflect the concepts and customs of their time. Furthermore, while recipes are about eating, they are also a form of literature capable of carrying knowledge, and in certain periods they even had a profound impact on social development. First, let's look at our first theme. We are all familiar with terms like boiling, roasting, frying, stir-frying, braising, and stewing. But have you ever wondered when these techniques appeared? What was their significance? And as we've entered modern society, have we developed new cooking methods? What do they signify? In this first part, we will answer these questions. When we think of cooking, we first think of fire. Learning to use fire was the most important step in human evolution, largely because it completely changed our diet. As historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto wrote in his book, The Taste of Civilization, cooking was the first chemical activity man engaged in, and the cooking revolution was the first scientific revolution. Through experimentation and observation, humans discovered that cooking could cause substantial changes in food, altering its taste and making it easier to digest. This dramatically increased the efficiency of calorie intake, leading to the evolution of our palates, organs, and brains in a better direction. Before fire, there were even older methods of food preparation, such as curing, air drying, or simply setting meat aside to let it ferment. These processing methods could qualitatively change food, aiming to improve the texture of meat and make it more digestible. Another method was burying. The book mentions that ancient Scandinavians would bury leftover salmon in the ground to ferment, creating a dish that remains a specialty today. Some nomadic peoples, during long migrations, would press chunks of meat under their saddles, using the horse's sweat to slow cook it for consumption. There is also freezing. Tibetans, for example, freeze mutton and shave it into thin slices to be eaten raw. But fire remains the most important cooking method. It fuses the protein fibers in meat and turns collagen into a gel. Direct roasting imparts a pleasant aroma and color to meat. The same is true for starchy foods. Fire breaks down starch, toasting dextrin into an appealing brown color. The sight of this color reassures us, because it signifies that the food is cooked. A roasting recipe Sitwell mentions in the book is particularly interesting. It comes from the great Roman poet Virgil's epic poem, the Georgics. In the poem, Virgil describes people skewering lamb on hazel branches to roast over a fire, praising the god of wine amidst the aroma of the meat. This method of roasting has been passed down from ancient times. If a lighter food, like a small bird, was being roasted, the heat would cause the sap in the branch to make it turn slowly. The ancients found this magical, believing it to be the work of the gods, and thus also used hazel branches for divination. As we will discuss later, the process of preparing food for ancient peoples was often closely linked to religious activities. Historically, in most cultures besides direct fire, the other primary cooking method was boiling. Unlike roasting or smoking, boiling is a more culturally significant method because it requires a vessel, and the creation of vessels is itself a hallmark of civilization. Ancient humans used their imagination, using things like seashells as cooking pots. Soon, boiling became the mainstream cooking method for people around the world and remained so for a very long time. In medieval Europe, one of the most common foods was pottage, a one-pot stew cooked in a crock or pot. Could be a stew, porridge, or soup depending on what was put inside. Pottage was shared by many, thus symbolizing community solidarity. People of all classes, rich and poor, ate this food. A commoner's pottage would contain grains, onions, and cabbage in a thin broth, while the rich or nobility would add chunks of bread, eggs, and meat, resulting in a thick stew. Commoners generally didn't eat meat, as living livestock was clearly more valuable. Cattle and sheep could plow fields, produce milk, and yield wool, while chickens and ducks could lay eggs. Killing them for meat was a real waste. However, commoners could hunt for game, though limited to small animals. Consequently, people became avid catchers of all kinds of birds. This interest extended to the upper classes, and recipes began to feature a bizarre variety of birds. Besides the common quail, there were swan, heron, cuckoo, lark, and even peacock. At first glance, those recipes look like a field guide to birds. Bird lovers would surely be heartbroken to see it. As ingredients became more abundant, people's methods for processing food evolved, often in relation to the ingredients' own properties. For example, frying with fats and oils using the gelatin from fish bladders, deer antlers, and calves' feet to make jellies and aspics, and utilizing the properties of milk proteins to make cream and cheese. These are all secondary transformations of food, far more complex than directly eating fruits, meat, milk, or eggs. This required not only an expansion of raw materials but also innovations in tools and technology. Roasting, braising, boiling, and frying are all time-honored, traditional methods. It can be said that until the 20th century, although humanity's diet underwent enormous changes, cooking methods remained fundamentally the same. After the 20th century, however, everything changed. The food we eat may not seem vastly different from that of the 19th century, but the tools we use are a world apart. For example, the 65th recipe in the book is for creamed mushrooms on toast. This recipe, which appeared in the early 20th century, is simple yet profound. Although creamed mushrooms are the star, what we're really discussing is the toast. The book states that toast reveals the most fundamental magic of cooking. Imagine the difference between bread, toast, and buttered toast. First, bread is a combination of human labor and natural forces, where flour and water chemically transform into something entirely new, a magical transformation in itself. Toast, which is bread that has been sliced and cooked a second time, enters another stage. It requires new tools and operations to reprocess a food that is already edible. There's a practical reason for this. The second baking reduces moisture, extending the bread's shelf life. The third step, Buttered toast, a common Western breakfast, is created almost entirely to improve the eating experience. An ordinary food is thus turned into a delicacy, and that is the true magic of cooking. Humans spent at least 6,000 years perfecting the art of bread making, but it's only in the last 100 years that we've truly mastered making toast. This is all thanks to the popularity of the toaster. In 1919, the first pop-up toaster was born in the United States. Over the next 2 decades, its sales in America surged from 400,000 to 1.2 million units, and it quickly swept through Europe. It's a unique kitchen appliance. It has a single function and takes very little time. You could argue it's non-essential, yet its presence is powerful. It symbolizes the increasing specialization of kitchen tasks and reflects the rapid development of technology and the proliferation of appliances. So, is the flourishing of gastronomy inevitable? It's hard to say. The advancement of technology can sometimes be perplexing. In the 20th century, along with the toaster, gas stoves, electric mixers, refrigerators, and microwave ovens became popular. Sometimes they greatly facilitated culinary development, but at other times, they were anti-cooking. Why do we say that? First, these shiny new metal gadgets became the new servants of middle-class households, replacing maids, butlers, and cooks. This meant that professional chefs gradually left the home kitchen, and home cooking and commercial cuisine went their separate ways. Second, the core function of most appliances is convenience, not refinement. The microwave oven is a perfect example. On a technical level, it's a revolutionary invention, using electromagnetic waves to make molecules vibrate at high speed to heat food, rather than the infrared radiation produced by fire. But from a culinary perspective, its results are not ideal. Microwaves cannot make food crispy or achieve a beautiful, golden brown crust. Most of the time, it's only suitable for reheating leftovers or processing semi-finished products from the supermarket, producing food that is far from appetizing, let alone creating the warmth of a family gathered around a shared meal. As for the benefits of the microwave, the first is, of course, speed. As the 83rd recipe in the book notes, you can make a small cake in just 5 minutes. Second, in the 1970s, when the microwave rose to prominence, it symbolized liberation. With it, people no longer had to eat at the same time at the same table. They could just ding their food whenever and wherever they pleased. This change in dining habits symbolized the dissolution of patriarchal or matriarchal oppression. In other words, the microwave, to some extent, triggered a new revolution in social relations. Today, however, we sometimes find ourselves wishing for a warm, communal meal to strengthen the bonds between people. Furthermore, the anti-cooking nature of appliances is also reflected in how they distance us from natural ingredients. This is also easy to understand. The recipe immediately following the mushroom toast is for strawberry ice cream. Again, this chapter isn't about the ice cream itself, but about the electric refrigerator. The refrigerator solved the problem of food preservation, positioning itself between the production and consumption of ingredients. With a refrigerator, we no longer deal directly with the source of our food. We are no longer faced with living animals, but with pre-portioned steaks, lamb chops, and pork loins. Philosopher Wang Minan writes in on household appliances, "All food exists in the refrigerator in the form of a corpse, but the refrigerator conceals its former death. When a piece of meat is taken out to thaw, the rock-hard frozen meat slowly returns to a soft state, as if the meat's basic form were stone, as if its original source were the refrigerator, as if the refrigerator created this piece of meat. People gradually forget its origin. The convenience and the anti-cooking nature of new-era cooking tools are always intertwined. This seems to suggest that we always struggle to find the perfect balance between eating to live and living to eat. We are, indeed, living in an era full of contradictions and confusion. Having covered the history of cooking methods, let's now turn to the history of recipes. The recipe is the most distinct thread running through this book, and every recipe included has its source cited. Therefore, it tells not only the history of food, but also the history of cookbooks. In this second part, we will discuss the human culture reflected in recipes and the journey of the recipe from its emergence to its maturity. The first recipe Sitwell lists doesn't come from a book, or even from parchment or a stone tablet, but from an ancient Egyptian mural. In Thebes, In a tomb numbered TT93, a woman named Senet is buried. She lived over 3,900 years ago during the 12th dynasty. On her tomb walls, alongside scenes of hunting and farming, is a remarkably detailed depiction of the bread-making process. These scenes of bread-making in Egyptian murals were not, of course, intended to instruct chefs, but to comfort the souls of the deceased, ensuring they could enjoy fresh, delicious bread in the afterlife. In Western culture, bread is an important and sacred food. In fact, in many cultures, staple foods hold a sacred significance. For much of history, humanity suffered from chronic hunger, so staple foods that could fill the stomach held an extremely high status. Staples usually require farming, and farming itself is akin to a humble ritual of worship. People bend over day after day to plant, cultivate, weed, and harvest, all in exchange for a chance at survival. For example, in ancient American civilizations, corn held a divine status. In Christian rituals, only bread made from wheat can be used for Holy Communion. The important status of bread in the West was established in ancient times, continued through the long Middle Ages, and persists to this day. The English word, Lord, originally meant the one who gives bread, while lady originally meant the one who makes bread. The person in a family responsible for earning a living is called the breadwinner, a term still in use today. Now, back to the ancient Egyptian murals. These bread-making scenes also prove that as early as 1900 BCE, the Egyptians had mastered relatively sophisticated food production techniques and understood the use of yeast. This is also recorded in the Bible. The Old Testament's book of Exodus describes how the Israelites, when expelled from Egypt, had to leave in such a hurry that they had no time to prepare leavened dough, taking only unleavened dough with them to make unleavened bread on their journey. Unleavened bread thus became a symbol of the Jews' escape from Egypt and their freedom from slavery. During the annual Jewish festival of Passover, it is the only flour product allowed. This is another facet of the close interweaving of diet and culture. Besides Egyptian murals, recipes also appeared on cuneiform tablets left by the Babylonian civilization. Yale University holds several ancient Babylonian tablets from around 700 BCE, one of which was successfully deciphered in 2004. Archaeologists had thought they recorded complex formulas or medicinal recipes, but it turned out they were actually recipes for food. This cuneiform recipe recorded extremely complex cooking processes. Sitwell writes, "Even back in an age when the exotic script had only 11 letters, and people were still busy inventing the wheel and using chicken livers for divination, the work of chefs was not so different from what it is today. The difference was that they weren't working in ordinary kitchens. The meals recorded in these recipes were prepared either in palaces or temples and often carried deep religious significance. The appearance of food in important records like murals, cuneiform tablets, and the Bible not only shows later generations what ancient people ate, but also demonstrates that cooking was a crucial part of early human social activities. Later, as humanity entered the age of writing by hand, there was more room for recipe writing. Recipes, like other written materials, reflect the level of civilization and social thought of an era. Around the beginning of the Common Era, Greco-Roman civilization had reached a considerable height, a fact evident in the recipes of the famous Roman chef Apicius. Sitwell even asserts that the pinnacle of Roman civilization is hidden in its masterfully crafted sauces. Sauce was the signature product of ancient Roman cuisine. In Apicius's book on cooking, he lists over 500 recipes, more than 400 of which are for sauces. In modern cooking, a sauce is typically used to enhance or elevate a flavor, but it remains a mask for the food it accompanies. In ancient times, however, sauces were precisely what was used to complement the finest ingredients, because sauce itself was a specialty of courtly cooking. Making a sauce required blending a large number of ingredients, making it both expensive and laborious. The chemical reactions in sauce making could produce surprising transformations in ingredients, belonging to the realm of professional technique. Without extensive practical experience and broad knowledge, it was impossible to create a top-tier sauce. The methods for making sauces were complex and difficult to remember, so they had to be recorded in writing, thus becoming the privilege of the literate. Delving deeper, in a sense, part of a sauce's function was to make food less like food, to replace nutritional value with aesthetic beauty, using art to conceal and remove the food's natural state. Like the use of fire, humans attempted through this action to distinguish themselves from nature as a farewell to barbarism. It was another step forward in humanity's journey of civilization. Let's return to the famous Roman chef, Apicius. His recipes show that his cooking was the height of luxury, with ingredients including all sorts of rare birds, exotic beasts, and delicacies from land and sea, such as peacock, flamingo, truffles, and sea urchins. Although he was of noble birth and great wealth, even he could not sustain such extravagance. After countless lavish banquets, he finally ate himself into poverty. When he was left with only his last few gold coins, he decided to host one final grand feast, inviting all his friends and family. The banquet was a perfect success, with hosts and guests all enjoying themselves. But in this joyous atmosphere, he added poison to his own final dish, ending his life in legendary fashion. With his life, he made a statement: "A life without fine food is not worth living." The legendary story of Apicius also reflects a prevalent philosophical trend of the time, Epicureanism. This school of thought emphasized pleasure, believing that happiness is the purpose of life, an innate and supreme good, and that one should strive for a life of happiness and tranquility. After the fall of this culinary god, recipes rarely appeared independently for a long time, usually existing only as fragments scattered throughout poems, philosophical books, or aristocratic memoirs. In 476 CE, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe entered the long and dark Middle Ages. For the next 500 years, famine was a major theme. For the vast majority of common people, they cooked whatever they had, with no room to speak of fine dining. It wasn't until after the 10th century that the famine situation in Europe began to improve. Coupled with the spices and seasonings brought back from the East by the later Crusades, European cuisine gradually began to change, and more professional recipes started to appear. Of course, these writings initially appeared in royal and noble households, some compiled into separate volumes, while others served as cookbooks, etiquette manuals, and guides to court affairs all in one. In the Middle Ages, literacy was rare, so cookbooks were extremely uncommon. The ancient copies the author saw in various museums and libraries had no oil stains or smudges. They were meticulously preserved by generations of collectors, placed alongside ancient treasures like Don Quixote and 1001 Nights, their pages as clean as those of a Bible. The documentary value of these cookbooks is no less than that of historical chronicles, often revealing subtle historical details. On one hand, they depict a picture of life among the European upper class. Noble cuisine emphasized refinement and spectacle. For example, a 14th-century English recipe scroll co-authored by the chefs of Richard II, the Fermi of Curry, documents large-scale banquets. Besides the vast variety and quantity of food, the preparation methods were astounding. For instance, the appetizers were all castles, sailing ships, or large birds of prey sculpted from jelly or sugar paste, and the bigger, the better. These appetizers looked nothing like food, they were like sculptures. You can imagine attending the king's dinner, and the first course brought to the table isn't a beautifully decorated but small cold dish, but a castle model built entirely of food. Your jaw would probably drop. This was the typical medieval feast. On the other hand, cookbooks also reflect the cultural exchanges and changes between nations during specific periods. For example, there was an English recipe book from 1440 called A Boke of Cookery. Since printing was not yet widespread, this book was mostly handwritten, with very casual wording and spelling. Just reading the text would be confusing for a modern reader, as it's full of strange words. But once read aloud, it becomes mostly understandable, as the words are just simple, common terms spoken with a strange medieval accent. Besides spelling, these cookbooks also clearly reflect the influence of French on English. Recipe authors often used English spelling conventions to sound out French words. This is related to a specific historical context. In the 11th century, French feudal lords led by William, Duke of Normandy, conquered England and established the Norman dynasty, an event known as the Norman Conquest. The cookbooks that appeared at that time were written in Latin and Norman French, and many terms thus remained in the English language. For example, words describing living animals like cow, sheep, and pig typically derive from Old English, while the corresponding terms for meat on the table, such as beef, mutton, and pork, are variations of French words. This type of recipe was less a practical guide and more a form of secret knowledge, accessible only to the upper class and professional chefs. Just a few decades after the handwritten A Book of Cookery appeared, printed cookbooks began to be published across Europe. As a result, cookbooks, like other literary forms, opened up broad channels for social mobility. A person could learn the ways of the upper class by studying books on cooking, household management, or etiquette. This also reflects the dual meaning of literacy. It was originally a tool for the ruling class to establish power, with written documents holding sway over the commoner's spoken word, symbolizing a kind of privilege. Later, however, it became a means of enlightenment and a tool for expanding knowledge. In the 17th century, aristocratic recipes circulated widely, and courtly cuisine entered society. At first, courtly dishes were merely an aspirational goal, but soon, every bourgeois family was competing to learn them, striving to make them their own standard of living. This process moved swiftly, and before long, the secrets of Louis XIV royal chefs were disseminated through these cookbooks. The first was Le Cuisinier François in 1651, and later, another of Louis XIV chefs, François Machelot, published Le Cuisinier Royal et Bourgeois. Bourgeois refers to the middle class, and from the title alone, we can trace the trajectory of high cuisine spreading through society. About 100,000 copies of such books were published at the time, which was a bestseller for that era. The subsequent Industrial Revolution greatly accelerated the dissemination of recipes. The burgeoning European bourgeoisie was ambitious and had a hearty appetite. Especially in France, the masses had just sent the aristocracy to the guillotine, and that atmosphere, both terrifying and exhilarating, seemed to whet people's appetites. The new rich of Paris craved new fashions, new homes, and the fine food they had previously been denied. They no longer had to wait for an invitation to the king's feast. The king had lost his head, but their mouths were still very much on their own faces. Around the early 19th century, fine dining began to be an indispensable part of mainstream culture, and eating became a serious business. The cookbooks published at this time, such as The Art of French Cooking, were precisely targeted at the middle-class market. The same was true in other European countries. In Britain, Eliza Acton released Modern Cookery for private families. This culinary expert keenly sensed that the industrial elites driving social change were a new type of middle class with new knowledge and new tastes. It was these people who were leading the new era of science, art, and literature. Therefore, she said, "It is the duty of our society to see that these people eat well." Compared to medieval and earlier recipes, the recipes of this period were much clearer and more straightforward. The quantities of all ingredients and cooking times were listed one by one, very similar to our recipes today. Practical, efficient, and swift, this was the spirit of the industrial age, and it has continued to this day. The food of this time was also vastly different from that of the Middle Ages. Simple and convenient sandwiches, single-serving cupcakes, and apple pie, symbolizing the independent and free spirit of the nascent United States, all began to appear in cookbooks. Recipes developed a relatively uniform format and were further segmented to cater to different groups and needs, finally reaching maturity. And that brings us to the end of the evolution of Western cookbooks. Let's summarize. From ancient Egyptian murals and Babylonian cuneiform tablets to Roman recipes, through the Middle Ages and into the modern era, the recipe evolved from an abstract, integrated record of a craft into a specialized, functional text. Throughout this process, recipes not only showcased a myriad of strange and wonderful dishes, but also often reflected the concepts, customs, and intellectual currents of a society. In modern times, cooking even became a ladder for breaking through class barriers. The history of recipes is inseparable from the history of food, and also inseparable from the history of writing. With that, we've shared the essence of the book A History of Food in 100 Recipes. Let's briefly review today's content. First, we learned about the history of cooking methods. Cooking aims to make food more digestible and delicious. In human history, methods like burying, air drying, roasting, boiling, and frying appeared in chronological order. Cold processing like burying and air drying were the oldest techniques. The later emergence of roasting marked a major breakthrough for human civilization. This was followed by the more culturally significant method of boiling, which required the invention of containers, and later still by frying, which had even higher demands for cookware. As cooking methods became richer, humanity progressed step by step toward civilization. In the industrial and electric age, the popularization of kitchen appliances ushered cooking into a new era of convenience and speed. At the same time, however, these tools also possess anti-cooking characteristics, distancing us from our natural connection to food. This paradox is perhaps a defining feature of our times. In the second part, we recounted the history of recipes. The history of recipes interlinks the history of food and also reflects the history of writing. It presents a fascinating perspective on human culture, such as the profound connection between food, religion, and philosophy. Cookbooks, like other literary forms, were initially a sign of class stratification, but later became a tool of enlightenment, opening new channels for social mobility. Congratulations, you've just finished another book.